sure. What the hell? All right, we were recording, I think. Yes, we were recording.
It says recording, yeah.
All right. All right. Let me just, I have like a million tabs open here, so I'm going to shut those million tabs down and we can get going here. Karen, you want to introduce yourself and I'll introduce myself and we can go around and say hi to everybody else and then we'll jump into things here.
Absolutely. My name is Karen Beck-Pooley. I'm a school director with the Bethlehem Area School District, and I'm also a founding member of BASD Proud Parents, our parent organizing committee and advocacy group that sort of speaks on all things related to public education, gets more parents involved and aware of some of the issues facing public education, and just gives our parents and our students in our district a chance to brag about the things we're doing. So that's me, right? You want to?
My name is Raymond Rose, and I'm a school board member here at Pottstown School District. And I'll go around and call people out, and you can just kind of just give us a intro to who you are, and then we'll go there. Okay. Gay, you want to go ahead? You're on.
Hey, did you say?
Not Kay, Gay.
Okay. Oh my goodness. Okay. Okay, Gay.
But she's on mute.
Gay, you're on mute.
There you go.
Thank you, sorry.
No problem.
I'm a member of Power Metro in the Delaware County area team. And I'm a member of Central Baptist Church in Wayne. And Power being an interfaith organization with many congregations across the state. But we're looking to connect with others who are interested in fair funding on the state level. And so that's it.
Okay. Thank you for joining us. Laura, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I'm Laura Johnson. I'm a school board member in Pottstown.
John?
Good afternoon or evening. I'm John Armato. I'm also a board member in Pottstown School District, and I also serve as the volunteer director of community relations. My greatest claim to fame is my wife, Marlene Armato, is a true activist for fair funding and education and a member of Power.
Okay. Kay?
Oh, okay. I'm Kay McGowan, and I am Laura Johnson's neighbor. And I was so thrilled to hear and know when Laura ran for school board in Pottstown, because I live in Pottstown as well and have for many, many years. And John Armato, you are an icon in the Pottstown School District. In Raymond Rhodes, I'm glad to see another younger person on the school board. I don't have children in the Pottstown School District, but I work for Montgomery County and have for many, 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 many years. And I'm just now almost getting to retirement, and I'm starting to get more interested in the political aspect of life. And fair funding for school districts like Pottstown, Norristown, where my office is very important. So I'm just here to learn, and here we are.
Thank you so much. Paul?
Hey, I'm Paul Friel. I'm a member of the school board over in neighboring O&J Roberts School District, so not too far away from the folks in Pottstown. And I've been involved with the fair funding and with the school equity issues for the last year. I think after Laura and I met as we were running for school board, she quickly dragged me in and talked about Pottstown and funding, and I've been sold and on that ever since. With all school districts and all the equity issues that go into school funding here. So happy to be here.
All right. We have somebody else whose name is John. John, do you want to intro yourself? He's not muted, but I don't know if he's listening. Oh, wait, hold on. All right, unmute yourself. All right, Kathy, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi there. I'm Kathy Skitko. I'm a former Pottstown school board member. It's been a while, but and I'm involved with the Hobart's Run Neighborhood Improvement Initiative in Pottstown, and just interested in learning more about the fair funding issues, which I certainly believe in very much. And hopefully, there's a way we can partner and help with these initiatives.
Great.
And I'm going to be in and off video just because I'm at home and all kinds of stuff's happening, but I'm trying to listen in.
Trust me, we understand. All right, Audra, do you want to jump in?
Good evening, everybody. Hi, I'm Audra Ross. I am a board member of Mosaic Community Land Trust, who does a lot of work with the neighborhoods in Pottstown. We have the community gardens, and we do work with a lot of the youth in town. And just on a personal note, I'm just an advocate for fair funding and want to learn what I can and get involved in the conversation and hopefully help out.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. All right, well, why don't we jump right into, we have a slide share. I'm sorry, you have a hand raised, Kay?
This is how I, on my Zoom, work Zooms stuff. I will raise my hand when I need, like I'm in school, but I just wanted to, Mr. Friel from O&J, I was actually listening the other evening. I don't know if you were on, Laura, or not, but when you, there was kind of a debate, I guess, with Mr. Hennessy. And can someone tell me whether or not our district, Laura Johnson, will we be voting for that Congress or for that position?
State representative it is.
Yeah, some parts of Pottstown are in that legislative district, and some are in Joe Cerisi's. So, Kay, you and I are Joe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you think about it,
Very good. Thank you.
Where the Hill School is and you go west of there, that's generally the 26th district. And Joe kind of would be the other side of that.
I got you. Well, good luck in your election.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, that's it.
You can vote for Paul if you want, but it's not going to count. So, I mean, you know.
Hey, we have enough issues going on with the voting system these
You don't
days.
need to add voter fraud to it.
I'm going to be on the up and up.
All right. All right. Well, Karen, do you want me to leap in, or do you want to leap in, or how do you want to go?
Go ahead, feel free to get started.
Okay. All right. I'm going to share my screen, and we'll start our slide deck here. This at least is working. So can everyone see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah, it looks good.
All right. Okay. So we're going to be talking obviously about fair funding today. Karen and I put together a new slide deck of information, and we'll also, if people are interested, we can watch the video that Power put together a couple years ago that I think they're actually in the process of updating. But, you know, a lot of this information for some of you might be information you've heard before. Some of it might be new for you, but we'll just kind of leap right in. So look, at the end of the day, if you're in an underfunded school district like Pottstown is, and a lot of neighboring school districts, then you probably already know some of this information. But if you're not, you know, when people start to learn more about this problem, well, it's time to get angry. You know, I mean, it's definitely frustrating that there are a lot of things that are going on in terms of funding for education, and there's not a lot that people seem to want to do about it. There's a lot of excuses that seem to be given by legislators. So let's start off with, state dollars in Pennsylvania account for just 1/3 of all public education funding. That spending, that amount that Pennsylvania spends, puts them really like low in terms of who they, of how much funding they put into education. So the average among all states is closer to 47%. Pennsylvania is like 47th of, Pennsylvania ranks 47th out of 50 states in terms of its share of public school funding. So you might say, well, where does that other funding come from? So, some of it comes from federal. In case of Pottstown, we get a lot we get some from grants, but the rest of it is being made up by the local, the district. It's made up by the taxpayers. So this has, localities covering more of the cost, and that means that disparity between communities become disparities between schools. So the result, Pennsylvania's poorest school districts spend 33% less per student than its richest ones, the largest funding gap of any state in the nation. So that's what you're finding. I mean, every year we go through this. We luckily didn't do it this year, but we'll probably have to end up doing it again next year. We have to raise taxes because the cost of education doesn't seem to go down. Our school districts are finding ways to tighten their belts to the point where they can't tighten their belts anymore, and we're cutting programs. But at the end of the day, other school districts are left with a flux of cash, and they're trying to decide what new stadium they're going to build. So that doesn't seem particularly fair. So we've got two-part challenge here. A state share of public education that ranks among the nation's lowest, and major disparities between rich and poor school districts spending that ranks among the nation's highest. And it's really, it sort of divides that line between the school districts. It is literally a term of, a time of the have and have nots. So the solution, Pennsylvania needs to increase basic education funding and distribute it early. I'll get into this for a moment, and then we'll kind of play the video. So, the solution, which is the fair funding formula, which exists and was started in 2016, it was created by a bipartisan basic education funding commission. The fair funding formula incorporates student-based factors, overall enrollment, portion in poverty or English language learners, and school district-based factors, transportation challenges, local taxing effort and capacity, to determine what portion of state dollars each district should receive. So this is an algorithm, that has a bunch of different factors that is put together, that the state then decides, how much of the funding is going to go to what school. The problem is that this fair funding formula, which would even it out, is only for new money. So it's only for new money that's been added that year. So if you're looking at this, I think this was based on the 2021 budget. The budget itself was 89%, and there was 11% new money that was added. So you had the basic budget, and you added this 11%, and that 11% is what was funneled through the fair funding formula. So why only new money? Pennsylvania holds harmless approach dating from the early 1900s ensures that school districts receive no less 1 year than they did the last year. That means that 30-year-old enrollment data still dictates how funding gets split. As I'm going through this, if anybody has any questions or any comments, or they want to scream foul or yell out things, please, I'm sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. I apologize. And Karen, if there's anything that you want to just jump in and say, please do so. We're thinking about that 30-year-old data. So, okay, so is that 30-year-old data still relevant? Much has changed. in the past 30 years. While public school enrollment statewide has remained fairly steady during this stretch of time, the Basic Education Funding Commission noted that dramatic changes had occurred at the district level, with roughly 2/3 of the districts shrinking. I have to move my thing here, sorry. Why is this not? And 1/3 growing. So today, growing districts receive $1.14 billion less collectively than the fair funding formula suggests they should get. And for these districts, hold harmless actually means held harmed. So let's look at some numbers here. What is that? Who is this hurting? Underfunded districts currently educate 51% of all students. That means 51% of all students in Pennsylvania are in an underfunded district. 78% of all Black students are in an unfunded district. And 82% of all Hispanic students are in an unfunded district. Looking at significantly underfunded districts, so these are districts that are I believe they're less than $10 million underfunded, right, Karen?
Yeah.
That's 51% of all Black students and 52% of all Hispanic students. So of these school districts that are $10 million in the, underfunded already, that's 51% of all Black students and 52% of all Hispanic students. Taxpayers are also held harmless or held harmed because they're paying 1.5 times as much as the most underfunded school districts. They're paying at 1.5 times as much in the most underfunded school districts as in the most overfunded ones. So if you had like your house was valued at $185,000, homeowners would pay $3,145 in real estate taxes in the most overfunded districts compared to $4,700 in the most underfunded ones. So, again, you're looking at your kids are getting hurt and the taxpayers are paying more taxes than they should compared to school districts that are overfunded.
Ray, did you see Audra's question?
I did not.
It says, question, what are the representatives' logic in keeping the hold harmless and not adjusting the 30-year-old hold harmless? Is there an argument or do they just refuse to address? So, I think anybody, I can answer that or others can jump in.
Well, yeah, here, I'll give you the short answer. The short answer is they're afraid they won't get reelected. That's the short answer.
And from my experience, the logic that gets used is often, well, it's not really about money. Money doesn't make a good education, which is ironic then that they aren't willing to have money distributed equitably because they seem to be afraid of losing money, but whatever. Or they give the logic of like, well, I've been told if your district is having financial trouble, well, it's because your school board hasn't learned to spend money wisely. They basically pivot and blame the school districts. That's, as much as that doesn't seem like logic, that is the logic they seem to try to use. And the other part is that they say that adjusting it so that everything would go through the fair funding formula, they would say, hey, look, that would hurt other districts. We can't hurt some districts to help others. And that kind of goes with that. The rationale there is that the status quo is the way to measure harm. And if you change it and take something away from someone, then you're harming them. There's not a kind of recognition of like harm is getting less than what you need, not less than what you've been getting. So there's a few different kinds of attempts at logic there. And some people will just say politically it's not possible. That's, they kind of shift around depending on what argument they think might work or whatever. Pivot.
It's the argument of the week that they're choosing for. Well, we've also heard, I think, from people that, we've heard, well, if we do 100% fair funding, there's not enough money in the budget for it right now. And we've heard that too, I think at the end of the day, the way I sort of see it is trying to look at it from their point of view. If I'm a representative and I've been hired, I've been voted into office to take care of a district, and am I going to actively take money away from that district so that I can help another district? Like, am I, in their mind, do they feel like they're doing my job? Oh, I mean, I would love, Audra said, why would it hurt schools? Can't their boards make financial adjustments? Sure. I would love for some of the overfunded school districts who, mind you, the school districts that are overfunded probably think that they're actually underfunded to a degree, because at the end of the day, you can have a massive influx of cash that'll come into your school district, and you're still going to have a discussion about budget, and you're still going to think, well, we're just not getting enough money as it is. But I would love, I'd love to see the school districts that are overfunded have to have the conversations that anybody here who's a school board member has had to have, where we're having a discussion. I mean, just a year ago, we were having a conversation about a salary for one teacher. We had a massive conversation that involved a fair amount of the school, and we were talking about $100,000 out of a $64 million budget. So I'd love the opportunity for them to have those conversations, but that's just me personally.
Well, and they may have some version of those conversations, but it's a matter of like other districts have conversations about, should we raise taxes, including ones that are getting above what the fair funding formula says. It's just a matter of degree. So a lot of which I think you're probably we've started getting into is the tax stuff. Like districts that are underfunded, we're already paying a higher tax burden compared to those that are getting more than their fair share. But all of us are probably having a conversation about raising taxes. So it can sound to other people like, well, yeah, we have to raise taxes too. Well, yeah, we have to talk about positions too. And it's a matter of if you compare apples to apples, though, the starting spot that we're talking about is not the same. I mean, the tax burden for Pottstown is the 6th highest in the state, and there's multiple positions that we don't have, or programs we just don't have, whereas other districts might legitimately have to talk about how they would deal with those, that budget shortfall if they had it, and they would have to have tough conversations. But it's just the starting spot is not the same.
Yeah, and I think, the state representatives are using this as a way to pivot away from the single issue and distract from it, because, funding from the state and the percentage of funding that they deploy is one separate issue from, is it fairly distributed? And should property tax be the primary driver of funding education in Pennsylvania? Separate question. If you're lucky to live in a district that has a large commercial base because someone drew it on a map and said, hey, the King of Prussia Mall is now in your district and not the other district right next door, that's a giant win for every taxpayer in that district that got the commercial base. Why is that? That doesn't seem fair to me, right?
Right.
So I think what you guys are doing right now is the proper thing, is putting representatives on the spot. And I also think, it's not about just the school district. You're not funding children. You're saying this child gets more of an opportunity for an education than this child does, because I'm going to give this child more resources. I don't think that's a fundamentally fair thing to do, and I don't think we as a state need to do it. Now, is it legitimate to say, if you pull $10 million out of this district and put $10 million into this district in one, like turning on a light switch, is that the best strategy? Will it be politically obtainable? And two, will those districts absorb those hits and absorb that revenue efficiently? Maybe not. Maybe there's a bridge that gets us from where we are to where we get to over 3 years, 5 years, something where we can say, all right, let's start putting this fair formula in place. And honestly, at the same time, we should be looking at the percentage of funding coming from school districts. I think, the fact that so much is put on property tax, if we could get this tied to some of those other resolutions, whether it be cyber charter funding reform or how much is in that state budget, I think it'll help go through. But fundamental unfairness of picking winners and losing with children and saying these children get more and these children get less, that's an argument I don't understand how anybody has a leg to stand on.
I think, if we could just, I agree with you, Paul. Like, I think, at the end of the day, we're saying, hey, we want 100% equity fair funding. But if somebody came to us and said, you know what, I think, if we did it over a 3 or 4 year schedule, I think we would jump at it right off the bat. I think at the end of the day, we just need representatives to admit, look, okay, all right, this isn't right. This is something that needs to be done. Where can we meet halfway? Where can we prepare the schools that are going to maybe lose some money? And where can we, to give them time to be able to spread that out? Also, where can we, implement the cyber charter reform that would help offset people's, the loss of money too, because that would benefit pretty much every school district out there, so. Kay, did you have something that you wanted to say?
Well, yeah, I was going back to listening to, for want of a better word, the kind of debate with Mr. Friel and Mr. Hennessy, and Laura's comments about legislators, and that's why I'm a big proponent of term limits, because I think you need to get fresh ideas in there all the time. But it became clear to me from Mr. Hennessy, who's been there for a very long time and a very nice man and has done some wonderful things, I'm sure. He clearly made that statement that the will is just not there among the legislators. And unfortunately, in our climate today, there has to be compromise, and we have to have legislators who are willing to talk across the aisles and compromise. Right. From the federal level all the way down to local levels, so I wanted to ask one question though, because I don't know enough about, so the fair funding is a legislative act of some sort, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
It's a law.
So it's the law. It is a law.
Yes.
I'm looking at, and I don't know how much people have looked into, and I'm sure there have been advocacy groups looked into the way other states have been funded or how they are funded. And maybe Mr. Armada, since you've been around a long time.
You say you're old, Jam.
Well, I'm old too. So, but my husband and I took many, many vacations to the state of Texas, and I found it so interesting. And we would go to high school football games because that's what you have to do when you're in Texas, right? I don't know, and they're called independent school districts. But the way they are structured, and I kind of found it, we both found it odd that their football stadiums were nicer than most of our Division 3 or 4, if there is a Division 4, college football stadiums. And this is at the high school level. Primarily, I guess, because of the way they structure their funding, but they allow for advertising. So companies advertise. And obviously, there's revenue in that for the school districts. I have no idea what I'm really saying, but I'd be interested to know if anybody's done research. And I know that would require a total legislative change.
Well, I mean,
again, you're talking about another revenue source. So at the end of the day, school districts, and Ray alluded to the primary revenue sources that school districts have. But, and when he talked about grants, Pottstown School District is one of the most aggressive at going after grants, fully 10% of our overall budget this year is due to grants that we've been successful in securing. So we're talking about $6 million a year in grants that we go out and collect, or I shouldn't go out and collect, find a way to earn those grants. Back to the original issue, and I am going to apologize because I have on Tuesday nights is also our wrestling coaches meeting that I'm late to now that I'm going to get to. And I'm going to try and hold my temper a little bit because every time we get on this subject, I start to get a little fired up. Paul talked about what is fair to kids. It's more than what's fair to kids. It's what's ethically and morally correct. And as a state, we have chosen to forget what is ethically and morally correct. Any legislator in the state of Pennsylvania that says they are not aware of the issues surrounding fair funding is either A, lying to you, or B, somebody that you don't ever want to vote for. And at the end of the day, when they get done talking and they talk about the will to make something happen, they're talking about their will to vote for something that might not be popular in the district that they are representing. That's the end of the day. When they say will, that's the will they're talking about. And understandably, granted, the point that Paul made about, okay, can you just pull 10 million? What would happen if you pulled $10 million away from a school district, forget hold harmless, and you pulled $10 million away from them? What would happen to them? I'll tell you exactly what would happen to them. What happens to the Pottstown School District every single year. We're faced with the dilemma of, do we increase property taxes or do we cut programs or do we do both to try to make up the difference? So they would be in the same boat as we are. And the age-old argument that legislators love to use is, you know what? You're not running your school district like a business and you're not being fiscally responsible. Well, listen, I'll tell you what, I don't want to be as fiscally responsible as the people in Harrisburg are, because if they're the example of how to run a budget, then I don't want to do that. And I would invite any legislator across the entire state of Pennsylvania, representative or senator, to come into our district and look at how we have been fiscally responsible to the community, while at the same time trying to provide quality educational opportunities for the people that are going to become the future citizens of our state. I didn't want to get fired.
John, you muted yourself.
Very well said, John.
And at the end of the day, I will feel free to share that with legislators, and I think I have. And clearly the gentleman that was debating Paul last week is a gentleman that I have shared this with on numerous occasions.
Thanks, John. All right, I'm gonna go through the rest of our slides, and then we can decide if we want to watch the video. So does anybody else have, Kathy, did you want to, or either Kathy, did you want to say what you said on chat, or we can read it? All right, so Kathy had said on chat, education is the most important thing for sure. And the other aspect, if I understand this correctly, is the domino effect that affects overall health of the community. Better funded schools are more attractive to residents who can invest in and spend money at more new and other businesses. Businesses pay taxes, which help the schools and the community overall, correct? And do legislators not get that? I mean, look, at the end of the day, you want your community to be as attractive as possible, right? To people to move into that district. Right? If I'm a legislator, I want people to talk about how awesome the districts are, how awesome my community they are. So I think that I want to do everything I can. That means I want my schools as great as I can be. I want the kinds of businesses that attract people. And all of that has to do with, you know, getting the right things for the people in my district. The way I sort of see it is that's probably what some of the representatives who have overfunded school districts are thinking, hey, that's what I'm doing, you know? So I can kind of see both sides of the argument. I don't think it's necessarily right, but I think at the end of the day, you know, the school districts that we represent are the school districts that are fighting for the scraps to be able to do what we do. And at the end of the day, I mean, our school district, I'm amazed with what they do with what little they get. You know, I mean, I can't speak more highly of the teachers that my children have, of the administration, and it all boils down to people who love educating, who love working with kids, that love the challenge. I mean, part of it is the challenge that is sort of thrown at them in this day and age when we want to legislate every single aspect of education as possible, as much as we possibly can. But at the end of the day, we shouldn't have to be fighting so much and so hard to get the right amount of money that our kids are due. I don't think we should have to be battling, you know, state legislators and calling them and scheduling, you know, face to face if we possibly can. I think we should have to be fighting as hard as we are to be able to get this through. That's what kind of boggles the mind.
Kathy's exactly right, though, in the premise that school districts are the foundation of communities. And to have a healthy and thriving community, you need a healthy and thriving education system, because it is foundational. All these kids are going to grow up, and as John said, you know, you want educated young adults who are good citizens and then are going to be good for employers to hire, and it just feeds on itself. You know, it's a cycle. And we got to make these investments. These are investments. These are core investments in the health of our community, and it makes no sense to just divide it and to be as unequitable. And every other equity issue you can derive right from here, whether it's social justice equity issues, whether it's access to quality and affordable health care. All these things are about how are we balancing this with our communities, investing in our communities to make sure that they can thrive. And education's at the forefront and the first thing we should be focused on.
All right, I'm going to share the screen again.
Sorry.
All right, so did I do this one? I don't think I did, but all right. All right, so we were talking about real estate taxes. Okay, so the idea that higher real estate tax burdens falls disproportionately on minority households who make up 30% of households in districts that stand to gain from fair funding, but just 7% of those in districts that stand to lose. So we're talking about the tax burden falling upon, you know, the people that they're you know, taking on the burden, but they're the people that this would help the most. Any way you look at, choosing to hold harmless is deciding to hold harmed. The lack of fair funding hurts students and taxpayers, particularly students and taxpayers of color. So what do? We need to allocate all state funding through the fair funding formula. Multiple bills to do so are currently in committees or are outside a committee that need to get into a committee. House Bill 961 and House Bill 2628 would implement fair funding in full immediately. Senate Bill 362 and House Bill 1313 would do so over the next 4 years. Enacting fair funding as part of a comprehensive package that also increases funding for public education, enacts needed special or charter reform, and reviews support for special education and the transportation subsidy would further help currently underfunded districts and neutralize the impact of funding shifts on currently overfunded districts. So if we just go on the black and white, where if we take the money away from districts that are overfunded and give it to underfunded districts, there are other things that we could reform that would help offset some of the negative amounts to the school districts that are overfunded. So it's not just, it's really, if you think about it, so it's really like systemic reform to education funding overall. It's not just the fair funding formula, but it's also the charter school reform. It's also how special education is funded. It's also about transportation. School districts spend a lot of money every year transporting their students, whether they're transporting their students locally to schools or to other schools or outside, as well as any kids that are within their school district grounds. So that's the end of our slide deck. Do you want me to put on the video? Hold on, can't see everybody. Should I put play the video? Okay, I'll play the video. All right, so for those of you who haven't seen this, are there people who haven't seen this video that was created by Power Interfaith?
I have not.
Okay, all right. Well, so for Kay and for other folks who this might be a new video for you to see. This is definitely an eye-opening video, and it's about almost 10 minutes long. So I'm going to go ahead and play it. I'm going to make sure that I do this correctly and people can hear it. So hold on.
You're doing a great job.
Okay, thanks. All right, I'm going to start playing. Tell me if you can hear it.
Pennsylvania has the most inequitable school funding of any state.
Can everybody hear it?
Yes.
Okay.
This graph ranks the 50 states based on the ratio of per student spending in the poorest versus the wealthiest districts in the state. In Indiana, poorest districts get 17% more funding per student than the richest districts, which helps provide the extra resources that poorer students tend to need for successful learning. Other states give smaller funding boosts to poorer districts, and in many states, richer districts actually get higher overall funding than poorer districts. But no state has worse inequity than Pennsylvania, where rich districts get 33% more funding per student than poor districts, nearly double the gap of the second worst state. In part, Pennsylvania's inequity is explained by the relatively low proportion of public school funding provided by the state as opposed to local revenue. While many states provide over half of public school funding, Pennsylvania provides only 34%, with nearly all the rest coming from local sources, primarily property tax revenues, which vary greatly based on local wealth. But that's only part of the problem. This talk will focus on the other part, how Pennsylvania distributes the state portion.
Hold on, I'm gonna make sure that I'm sharing this with the proper sound because I don't know if I'm doing it now properly. So hold on. Oh wait, I think here's the deal. All right. All right, let me try it again.
Of funding dollars among its 500 school districts. First, the good news. In June 2016, Pennsylvania passed into law a fair funding formula that specifies an equitable way to divide up education funding dollars. It takes into account many factors about each district, including the number of students, how many of those students live in poverty, how many are English language learners, and how sparsely populated the district is, among others, to calculate the relative needs of each district. This formula was unanimously agreed to by a bipartisan legislative commission and is widely viewed as fair. Now the bad news. Only 6% of state funding this year goes through the fair formula. The law specifies that the first $5.4 billion of funding, which comprised 94% of this year's state allocation, must be distributed in exactly the same unfair way that it was distributed in 2014, before the formula was enacted. This graph compares each district's actual per-student funding this year on the vertical axis with its formula-based fair share of funding on the horizontal axis. Each dot represents a district, and the dashed line represents fair funding. If all the funds were distributed by the fair formula, every district would fall somewhere on that diagonal line. Instead, we see many dots above the line, which are districts getting more than their fair share, and many dots below the line, which are districts getting less than their fair share. You can see that most districts are quite a distance from the line, meaning they are getting substantially more or less than the formula says they deserve. This is disturbing, that some of our students get way more than their fair share of resources, while others get far less. But what's even more disturbing is the pattern of which districts tend to get more or less funding. Here is the same graph, but with the dots shaded according to the proportion of each district's students who are white. You can see the clear trend that whiter districts tend to be above the line and darker districts below. The trend is even clearer if we use just two colors, yellow for the 250 whitest districts and brown for the 250 least white districts. Most points above the line are yellow, meaning whiter districts getting more than their fair share of funding, and nearly all the points below the line are brown, representing less white districts getting less than their fair share of funding. To quantify the difference race makes in funding, we can sort the 500 districts in order from least white on the left to most white on the right. So as you move from left to right, you're moving from the least white district, Chester Upland, whose student population is just 2% white, to a bunch of districts on the far right of the graph, whose student populations are 100% white. The size of each dot represents the number of students in the district. The vertical axis shows funding inequity, defined as the difference between fair funding and actual funding per student. Districts below the zero line are getting less than their fair share. Districts above the line are getting more than their fair share. You can see the clear trend that as districts get whiter, moving from left to right in the graph, they get increasingly more compared to what the formula says they deserve. To measure how much more, we divide the districts into 5 bins or quintiles by racial composition, each shown in a different color. Each bin contains the same number of students. Now we can compare the average funding inequity in each bin, and the trend is very clear. The whiter the district, the more generous funding they get compared to what they deserve from the state. Here are those 5 bins in a bar chart. The least white districts get, on average, over $1,900 less per student than their fair share, and the whitest districts get, on average, over $1,900 more than their fair share. And the trend is consistent across the whole range of racial composition. It's not just the least white districts that are affected by the pattern of racial bias. Rather, even average or majority white districts tend to get more funding the higher the percentage of white students. And this trend is uniquely correlated with race. If we look instead at poverty and examine the average inequity at different poverty levels, we find that the poorest students are getting shortchanged an average of $1,500 per student. But we don't see a clear pattern across the whole spectrum of poverty levels as we did with race. In fact, the wealthiest districts are getting about their fair share from the state. Middle-income districts are faring much better, and it's only the poorest districts, which, by the way, are overwhelmingly less white, that are slammed with dramatically less than their fair share of funding. So how does this funding inequity affect individual districts? Here's one example of 2 somewhat poor districts in western PA, East Allegheny and Titusville. The yellow bars show each district's actual funding this year. The purple bars show their fair share of funding according to the formula, and the green bars show the difference, or funding inequity. The formula says that based on their needs, they both deserve around $5,000 per student of this year's state funding. But East Allegheny, a racially diverse district that is 61% white, is getting just $3,600 per student. Titusville, which is 94% white, is getting $6,800 per student. These are two districts with nearly identical financial needs, yet the whiter district is receiving $3,200 more for every student than the less white district. Here's another example, this time of 2 fairly wealthy districts. The formula says their fair share of this year's state funding would be around $1,400 per student. Upper Merion is getting about $600 per student, $800 less than their fair share. But Southside District is getting a whopping $8,600 per student, a windfall of $7,200 over their fair share. And by the way, South Side is 99% white, while Upper Merion is 59% white. Here's an example of two districts that, despite vastly different needs, are getting the same level of funding from the state, about $3,500 per student. Penn Trafford is a wealthy district, 96% of whose students are white, with median household income over $70,000 and fewer than 10% of students living in poverty. Wilkes-Barre's average household income is about half that of Penn Trafford's, and about 41% of its mostly minority students live in poverty. Wilkes-Barre's fair share of this year's state funding would be around $7,000 per student, and Penn Trafford's $1,200. That amounts to over a $5,000 per student fairness gap between these two districts. We need to change the flawed narrative about education funding in Pennsylvania. We hear that Pennsylvania has implemented a fair funding formula. Yet that formula currently applies to only 6% of state funding. Current law locks in the historical inequities in the rest of the money forever. We hear that putting all state funding through the formula would decimate many districts. But decimate here is a code word for eliminating the unfair windfall these districts have been getting for decades. There are common sense ways to gradually transition to fair funding so that no district suffers drastic sudden cuts. Finally, we hear, we can't harm some districts to help others. This attitude is based on a flawed assumption that the status quo is the basis for measuring harm. But harm is getting less than you need, not less than last year. All students are equally deserving of adequate education, regardless of what their districts got in the past. Pennsylvania needs to distribute all, not just 6%, of its state education dollars through the fair funding formula.
All right. So for those of you who haven't seen that video before, what are your thoughts? And if you have seen the video before, you know, what comes to mind?
So I have not seen that video, and I thought it was fabulously done. And I whoever created it is brilliant, and I think every legislator needs to see it. I don't know if they have or not. And that is exactly the conversation that's going on in this country today about racial inequity, right? So I think of Mr. Friel, who I know lives in one of those wealthier districts, and my husband was employed by them for 25 years. And I can see how difficult it would be to be a legislator and try to be compromising with other legislators when you know that the school district that's wealthy, O&J Roberts, compared to Pottstown, when you as a legislator would be saying, we need to do this, but it's going to mean less funding for my school district. But it's got to be figured out. And from what I could hear Mr. Friel said on the other discussion, you know, you don't need to do it immediately. Just do it over a period of time, right? So I thought it was very well done. And maybe some of you know whether or not who made it and where it has been shared to and how many legislators have actually agreed to see it and understand it and hopefully care about it.
Yeah, I mean it's been around for a couple of years. I know that it's I mean we present it pretty much every workshop that we do. I know that it's been presented online and shared through many different platforms. And I know that they're working on updating it. So I don't know to an extent of how many legislators have seen it, but it's a very powerful video. And I will include the link when we put this up on Facebook and this recording up on Facebook. I'll include the link to it so people can read it also or watch it also, besides through the video. So, any other thoughts? Anybody have any questions or comments that, is kind of on the top of their head that they want to throw out?
I mean, I don't even sometimes know. Like every time I see that video, it tends to make me just kind of angry. Partly because it feels like, I mean, we've been talking about this for a while. Legislators who want to know. That's kind of what I feel like. I feel like there's a lot of just a lot of giving up and saying, it's just not politically possible, and kind of kicking the can down the road. And it can just feel like, we got some folks out there fighting for it for sure, but not enough to make the difference. And so it can just be frustrating to see that and be like, it's right there. Like the visual way that he pulls those apart to show the racial bias just feels so clear. It just makes me a little crazy that it's still happening.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think, at the end of the day, we as a group here, we want to just have the conversation with legislators. We just want to hear from them. Okay, if you don't support this, why don't you support this? Can you see how you could maybe change your point of view? There's some common ground. At the end of the day, we're looking to engage school district members in those districts that are underfunded, or even in districts that are, we've talked about this before, school districts where they're maybe on that line. I mean, there's school districts where they are literally right where they're supposed to be in terms of funding, but we want to have conversation with school board members to get their beat on things. And then really have a conversation with the legislators as to, look, why wouldn't you support this? Tell us your reasons. How can we make, what can we do to help this through? I think that when people say, well, it's not politically, possible, I think that's just a shutdown, right? Anything
Right.
is politically possible.
Well, and the reality is more legislative districts are underfunded than overfunded.
Right.
Like it really is politically possible.
Right.
It's just there's just a sense of apathy for a lot of legislators, at least on this issue. I mean, certainly because I think there's a dynamic where taking something away from a school district or anybody is more painful and will get you in more political trouble than giving new funding to somebody else. Like there's a greater cost, politically speaking.
But then if you look at charter reform, right? So then you're going to be putting money back in their pockets. So
Right.
why
Which
isn't this something that could be happening together? Why couldn't we be having a conversation about reform in general, funding reform in general? Why couldn't we be looking also, we talked about this a little bit tonight. What works for other states? If it's not property taxes, where can we be getting money that we could be using to fund education? If like Paul said, I happen to live in a district, and I don't, but let's say I happen to live in a district that happens to have a mall or a big industrial center, and now my school's got an influx of property taxes to pull from. It just happens to be that we have this in our area. Yes, obviously, as a district grows, as a community grows, they want to attract those businesses. They want to attract the people to live in the area, but also the businesses to be in the area and get to that sweet spot wherever it is, But at the end of the day, there are people who they lucked out, they just happen to have the businesses in the area. So what can we have? Where's the conversation that we can have that says, look, I need help. Can you help us? And I think that's there needs to be some give and take there. So.
I'll just add too, I think we're at a moment right now, like just nationally, when it comes to, racial justice and everything that touches, that I do feel like there are people who are potentially going to listen when it comes to this, or even just have a general, greater sense of urgency about the issue than maybe a year ago. And so I think that's, going to play to the advantage of getting this corrected is, people are a little bit more awake to just all of the things that are wrong in terms of every level of our, nation's, all of our systems. Like, just people are more and more open to hearing about that and awake to it. And so I think that plays in as well, so that when we're talking about this stuff, like whether it's posting stuff on social media or having workshops or meeting with legislators, people are like, oh yeah, like, I think of how many more people are saying Black Lives Matter right now than if you would go back 4 years.
Sure.
It's really remarkable. And so I think that's an important element of what's going on right now.
Well, if anybody who's been watching this video is fired up and angry, we would love for you to join us and help us with this issue. You can look up on Facebook. We'll be posting this in the group, but if anybody else is sharing this outside the group, there is a Facebook group called Pennsylvanians for Fair Funding. And this is a group that is made up of advocates who are working in a variety of different ways to try to get this issue out in front of people. Whether you're coming at this angle of social justice, whether you're coming at this from the angle of you're a parent and you want more funding for your school, or whether you're a taxpayer and you're pretty ticked about how much you pay in taxes, whatever gets you going here, we need help. So I would ask that people go to the group, ask to join the group, and we can point you in the direction of legislators who we are trying to actively engage and present our points and try to understand where their point of view is. So, all right, anybody else have anything else to add?
Yeah, I would like to, I hate putting Mr. Friel, especially since I can't vote for that district, but I hate to put him on the spot.
It's all fine.
He said he's a member of the O&J school board, right? A couple questions. In the event that you would win the election and become the rep for the district, are you allowed to, or are you planning to still stay on the school board? I don't know if there's rules around that. That's my first question.
Yeah. I'll well, if they let me. I mean, there's a policy that they'd have to allow me to stay. But if they do,
okay. So say okay. So that's my first question. I didn't know if that was legal or not. Say they allow you to stay.
Yep, I'm staying.
Yeah. How you're staying? Then how? Because I felt from your conversation earlier in the week, or maybe it was last week. Who knows what week it is? How, if you still remain on that school board, you appear to have been very logical about trying to implement this fair funding over a period of time. How will you react to your constituents in the O&J school district, being a school board member, if you remain so, when they come knocking at your door, protesting in front of your house, because this fair funding is going to take money away from O&J?
So funny enough, O&J is underfunded, believe it or not. So about 89% of O&J's budget comes from local property tax and only about 11% from federal and state combined. We just have to be one of those districts that have no funding from any commercial sources whatsoever. So we're not nearly what a Pottstown is. We're kind of a lot closer to the line. So it'd be a smaller hit here. But it doesn't matter. It's morally right. I think and I do believe it's a bigger issue than one issue. Is how do we fund education fairly in the state for all our kids? How do we give them the right resources? And I think the way that you can combine, whether it's this with charter funding reform and maybe some more a higher percentage coming from the state, can remove the sting. If you said, all right, it's going to be more of a neutral hit to maybe some of these, or we'll take some of the sting out of these hits because we're changing some of other forming, other funding sources and other revenue sources that go into education. And then districts that have been historically underfunded, like Pottstown, yes, they're gonna see resources come down, but that's just gonna get those kids up to like, and it won't even get them on par, because we're only talking about 37% of the budget, or 30% of the budget, or 20, depending on what the allocation between property tax and theirs. They're not going to be funded even if we fixed it tomorrow and said, oh, here's $13 million. They're not going to be Upper Marion. They're not going to be Radnor. I mean, you're not going to have the same on per student. Still going to be, significant gaps across the state. We'll still have disproportionate funding, but we'll make a long step in the right direction. And I think it would be fundamentally good for the community. And I agree with, I don't care if you were the one who said earlier about term limits and getting money out of politics. It's atrocious what happens. It really is. It shouldn't be about all these lobby groups and all these folks trying to put money in, and all these people who want to influence it, elections from the outside. What do your neighbors in your community think about what's going on here? But I don't want to take away from what this is. And I appreciate you bringing it up. And I purposely don't mention my running when I'm doing stuff like this, because, I'm an advocate for fair funding, regardless if I win or lose. I'll still be on the call the day after or the days after the election, no matter how that turns out, because I just think it's right. And we got to try to look and partner with other organizations too. I think the one thing that I've learned in this process on the political side is there are some really powerful organizations out there who are influential. And if they're on putting pressure and they have, thousands and thousands of members, we need to educate those active other organizations and call them out if they're not also morally outraged by the lack of funding in these school districts the way they are, and the racial bias in that funding the way it is, because it is the same thing. It is that they're fighting for on those other fronts. And, maybe they don't know and they don't have the information about it, but they would be powerful allies, and they need to be in this fight, because it is about that racial equity. It's about social justice. It's about what's fair and what's right. And so I think those other folks that we can bring in, and those other who have resources and power and influence, and get them involved in this fight with us for these things.
Thank you. That was a great idea as well.
All right, well, I think I'm going to wrap things up. If anybody doesn't have anything else to add, I want to thank you guys for joining us. Sorry about all the technical issues that we had tonight. It seemed that Zoom and Facebook didn't want to play well together, which is no big surprise. But thank you for sticking around and for joining us in the workshop. And I'll be putting this up on Facebook after we get done and it processes and all that jazz. So thank you guys for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, bye, everybody.
Thank you. Keep up the good fight, you school board members.
Thank you. All right, bye-bye.